Good morning and welcome to National Edition. I'm Deanie Wimmer. The idea of marriage has become highly politicized. A new nationwide survey conducted by Deseret News and BYU Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy reveals major differences in how liberals and conservatives view the institution of marriage. But it also shows a mutual agreement that the family is under attack.
Part of the data show that when people are talking about their own marriage, they're really quite happy with it. Or at worst, they think it's fine. Whereas when you ask them, how do you feel about marriage generally? Then they're kind of negative about it, actually. They're worried about other people's marriages and how this, shows a real problem in society.
Most Americans agree that a key social function of marriage is to improve children's lot in life. But when we explore this deeper, we discover variation. For example, children need both a male and female role model in the home was one question that we asked people to agree or disagree with. And vast numbers of those who are conservative or very conservative agree with this, while among those who are very liberal, it's more like around 25%.
Even though the social meaning of marriage seems to be different for liberals and conservatives, there's still a great deal to talk about. Both liberals and conservatives see families and marriage as in need of help and in need of improvement in society. They just see the prescription for that improvement. They diagnose the problem differently and they see the prescription a little bit differently.
One of the big takeaways is that people on the left view the problem with families as mostly having to do with economics. Whereas if you were a conservative, you tend to talk about family breakdown, single parent homes, things like that, or cultural decay that is associated with family.
We also asked people about the biggest problems facing family today, and the one that was chosen most often was the idea that parents are not teaching or disciplining their children sufficiently.
I hope that when people look at this study, it helps them realize that public opinion about families is not really some sort of polarized red-blue kind of argument.
Because the idea of family has been more politicized, I think part of what the survey shows is there is this opportunity to have good conversations, to find areas of common ground, to work together across partisan lines or ideological lines to find solutions that will support and help families.
I found that study so interesting, and joining me to help discuss this a little bit further is Allison Pond from the Deseret News, Chris Karpowitz from BYU, and we have Richard Reeves, co-director of the Center on Children and Families from the Brookings Institution. Thank you all for being here. I found that so interesting, the breakdown. But Richard, let's start with you, and I'm interested in what did you think about this study, and why is the institution of marriage so divisive right now?
I think it's a good survey. It's representative, and it's asked some really interesting questions in a balanced way. So as someone who works in the field, I'm really grateful for the data. It's actually quite a strongly pro-marriage survey in some ways, as you say in your segment, particularly when it comes to our own marriages. We all feel good about that. But it's also revealing a kind of plurality of the way people think about marriages, right? There's a very different conception of what marriage means to different people, as we've heard. But I do think this point about children and the kind of child-centric model of marriage comes across very, very strongly. And there is more agreement across ideological lines that actually bringing up children well and parenting well is a very strong point of agreement. Then the disagreement is whether or not that requires marriage or whether it requires a mother and a father. But nonetheless, I think the points of agreement are almost as important as the points of disagreement.
Yeah, one thing that he touched on that the survey really showed was a difference in the view of two parents in a home. Conservatives value that much more. Chris, does that mean that liberals have less of a value on a traditional family?
Well, I think they see the meaning of family a little bit differently from conservatives, but both liberals and conservatives, as Richard says, value family as an important institution for children, an institution that helps to protect children and that's important for children as they're growing up. In fact, when we ask people what's the most important issue facing families, the thing that almost everybody agreed about was that families should discipline their children, that families have a role in helping to raise children well.
And Allison, along those lines of children, regardless of whether they're liberal or conservative, they actually have a very similar family experience. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so in addition to asking people about their sort of social views of marriage, we also ask them some specific questions about what do you do in your marriage with your spouse and what do you do in your family with your children. Things like, you know, how often do you go out as a couple or discuss finances or have an argument or eat dinner together as a family, do chores together. And when you look at many of those measures, you see that there aren't real differences between liberals and conservatives, that the day-to-day lived experience of family life is still very similar. The only place we see a difference in that is when it comes to questions of religion and how often families pray or worship together.
In fact, Chris, people's experience can really shape how they view all of this.
Yes, absolutely. So we found that having children, for example, makes a big difference in how people view policies that are designed to help families. So, and sometimes that experience of of having children is just as important as their liberal or conservative ideology. We found that, for example, those who have had experience with government programs and have needed those programs in their families evaluate those programs more positively, whether they're liberals or conservatives, Republicans or Democrats.
So along those lines, Richard, we talk about how experience will shape your perceptions. We see in this survey that fewer people are having children and that fewer people are actually getting married. Will this help shape policy? If so, in what way?
Well, I think we see a division between the reasons why people are getting married. And I think, as Chris was just saying, Allison mentioned that actually marriage as a way of raising children remains pretty strong, regardless of kind of ideological background. I think where it might help is to think a bit about the shape of marriage as it goes forward. One question that you haven't addressed yet is whether or not equal marriage, whether same-sex marriage will strengthen marriage or not. And there's a huge ideological divide on that. And I think that also explains why the question about do you need a male and a female role model in the home did kind of create very different responses for those who are liberal versus conservative. For a liberal who hears that question, they see that as potentially excluding same-sex couples. And so I think that kind of what you're seeing is a kind of a fear of excluding some people from the institution on the part of liberals, and much less fear around that from conservatives. From the point of view of policy, I think the key thing here is to draw out what is it that's important about the relationships, how does marriage support that, and then what are the factors that policymakers can think about to support those things. I think the evidence that you can directly promote marriage is pretty weak, but it may well be that we can help provide more financial stability, more support for parents, and that will be true regardless of whether people are young or old or liberal or conservative.
An interesting debate, and I don't know if either of you have thoughts. We seem to come back to the fact that it's a lot on definition, that all this talk may actually strengthen the family, even as it does pose polarizing issues. Thoughts on that, either of you?
Yeah, I think certainly as Richard has been saying, there is an idea that family itself is very important for raising children, and I think people see that as a place where we can find agreement. So despite the fact that we find some disagreement about a number of different issues based on ideology or partisanship, it seems to me this survey shows that there are some huge areas where we can talk, where we can have some real conversations about policies that might help and support families in their different conditions.
Okay.
And I think that it's interesting as well to note that on several of these questions, what you see is not so much, liberals polarized at one end and conservatives at the other end, but a lot of liberals and young people sort of in the I don't know answer to a lot of these questions, that I leave this open for, however other people want to live this is, I don't have a strong opinion about that. But then when it comes to their own families and to the idea of children, then that does kind of influence views in a different way.
Yeah, even very young respondents to our survey who tended to be a little less certain about marriage, traditional forms of marriage, they weren't hostile to it. It wasn't that they, in general, were out to attack the family. They just wanted to be open to other sorts of arrangements as well.
Take a side.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
very small number thought it was obsolete, right?
Richard?
a very small number thought that marriage was obsolete and old-fashioned, right? Even among the young respondents. So there was a sense that it is a relevant institution, just in different ways to different people. So if we recognize that diversity, then I think on the whole, there's quite a good news story here for marriage in America.
But that seems to be the takeaway, that it's important and people have strongly, for the most part, strongly held beliefs. So I appreciate all of our guests, Allison, Tris, and Richard. We appreciate your insights on this. And you can read more about the survey online at national.deseretnews.com.